To kick us off.
Thank you very much, Father Thomas Joseph. So the second session today is dedicated to original righteousness, nature and grace before the fall. Our first speaker is John Bowling, who is Robert L. Stewart Professor of Philosophy and Christian Ethics at Princeton Theological Seminary. Professor Bowling earned his Master's of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York, and then his Master's of Arts and PhD from Princeton University. He is a member of the American Academy of Religion, the Society of Christian Ethics, and the Society for Values in Higher Education, and he also served on the editorial board of the journal Religious Ethics since 2003. His areas of specialization are Christian ethics, moral philosophy, social ethics and criticism, and the history of moral theology. And his courses also cover ethics and the problem of evil, ethics and politics in Augustine, war and Christian conscience, friendship, love, and justice. So many interesting topics. He's a member of the Presbyterian Church. Among many publications, the most important ones, I believe, are his book published in 1999, Contingency and Fortune in Aquinas' Ethics, published by Cambridge. And then in 2016, Tolerance Among the Virtues. He's currently working on a book on justice. Today, Professor Bowling will speak on originally righteous rule, which is dominion and not domination. So please join me and welcome Professor Bowling.
Thank you. And thanks to Thomas Joseph White, Father White, for the invitation to speak. I believe this is the third of these events you've invited me to speak at. Apparently I haven't screwed up yet. And to Sister Caroline Marie for organizing the event. You're going to get something different from me. I'm not a doctrinal theologian, and I'm not a metaphysician. I'm a moral theologian and a Christian ethicist, so you're going to get normative stuff. So, original righteousness. Original righteousness as an object of theological inquiry regards the will of the first human beings. And Thomas tells us that there are two topics to consider with respect to this object, two distinctions, two directions that inquiry might go. The first regards the grace and righteousness of the first human beings. The second regards the use of that righteousness in their dominion over other things. Righteousness as a condition of the soul, and righteousness as a consequence of that condition on human mastery and rule over other creatures. Early on, theologians on the Reformed wing of the Protestant Reformation divvied up the topics in roughly the same way. Here I refer to John Calvin, Peter Martyr Vermigli, Johannes Wolleb, and Francis Turretin. Turretin, for example, in volume 1 of his Institutes of Eclectic Theology, tells us that the first human beings were created in the image of God, and that this image consists in three things, most especially. First, antecedently in nature, as to the spirituality and immortality of the soul. Second, formally in rectitude or original righteousness, due to the grace in which they were created. And third, consequently, in dominion over other creatures and in the immortality of the whole person, including the body. In what follows, I consider original righteousness not formally and in itself, but in consequence. My concern will be with righteous rule in the state of innocence, in particular with human mastery and dominion over other human beings. Here again we find agreement between Thomas and the early Reformed. In question 96, Article 4 of the Prima Pars, Thomas asks whether mastery and servitude would have been present in the state of innocence, whether they would have been compatible with our original righteousness. Here he distinguishes those who by virtue of their office govern free persons by directing them to their proper ends from those who rule like a slave master, subjecting others to their arbitrary will and power. Citing Augustine's authoritative discussion in City of God 19, chapters 14 and 15, He argues that just men rule and command because their virtue befits them for this office, and because this office obliges them to order the affairs of those they rule by offering wise counsel and just commands. By contrast, the slave master commands not from genuine virtue or legitimate office, but rather from nothing more than a lust to dominate. Since this lust would have been incompatible with our original righteousness, slavery's mastery would not have been present in the state of innocence. But the other kind of rule, the governing and directing of free persons, would indeed have been present among the originally righteous, or so Thomas argues. He offers two reasons for this. First, because human beings are naturally social, because a well-ordered social life requires the coordination of diverse interests and persons, and because this coordination is best accomplished when one person rules the many for the sake of the common good they share. And second, because, says Thomas, even among the originally righteous, there would have been some disparities in virtue and knowledge, and it befits those who have these advantages to use them for the benefit of others, governing and directing free persons for the sake of their life together. It hardly needs mentioning that for Thomas, this diversity of virtue and knowledge would have more gender lines, or that women in the state of innocence would have always been ruled by others, never rulers themselves. Calvin agrees. In his commentary on Genesis 3:16, he refers to the relationship between Adam and Eve, husband and wife, before and after the fall, in order to distinguish just dominion from something like slavery's servitude. In the state of innocence, Eve was subject to Adam's rule, but her subjection, says Calvin, was, quote, liberal, not hard at all. After the fall, as punishment for sin, she is now cast into servitude. She is no longer free and self-ruling, but subject to the rule of her husband and dependent upon his consent. Of course, in this fallen state, Eve remains Adam's wife, not his chattel slave. And yet, the terms Calvin uses to describe her subjection to Adam, liberty and self-command lost, servitude imposed, make her condition under Adam's rule importantly similar to that of a slave under the rule of a master. For both Thomas and Calvin, then, the governing and directing of free persons would have been a feature of life in the state of innocence among the originally righteous. For both, the distinction between ruler and ruled would have been an ordinary feature of that life. Some would have fallen under the jurisdiction of another, others would have been ruled, and yet none would have been enslaved. Once again, both Thomas and Calvin are explicit about this. The rule that is a consequence of original righteousness would have been liberal and gentle, governing and directing free persons, not bound slaves. At the same time, neither Thomas nor Calvin nor the Reformed Orthodox theologians of the 16th and 17th centuries tell us much about how, in fact, a person under the jurisdiction of another in the state of innocence would nevertheless have remained at liberty, or explain what exactly distinguishes the agency and obedience of this free person from that of a slave. Put another way, none of them do enough to help us understand the key distinction that all of them assume, namely, how in the state of innocence there would have been dominion, but not domination. We might think that this little is said about this because, well, there's little to say, because the distinction between the agency and obedience of a free person and that of a slave is easy enough to make out. The distinction between the ruling power of the originally righteous and that of a slave master is, we might think, equally obvious. In Calvin's words, we might say that dominion in the state of innocence would always have been gentle, just as obedience would always have been liberal, while the dominating power of a master is always violent, a slave's obedience always coerced. Returning again to Thomas's remarks in question 96, Article 4 of the Prima Pars, there we find him distinguishing just dominion from slavery's domination in precisely this way. Slavery, he says, involves yielding, quote, to another what ought to be one's own, and thus a slave's obedience cannot be had without a slave master's penal violence. And of course, the righteous rule of free subjects in the state of innocence would require no such violence, if only because the laws that bind them would have been just, and the obedience that follows would have been willing. Okay, but let's make this harder. Let's admit, as elsewhere Thomas seems to, that there are cases of slavery servitude that both forego the master's violence and include the slave's willing obedience. Here the slave master dictates the ends the slave must intend and the means they must choose, and the slave endorses these dictates and so acts in accord with them. No doubt in some cases, the slave's endorsement will be half-hearted, and the subjunctive state of their will in response to what they do, their velleity, will be negative. If they could act in some other way, apart from their master's dictates, they would. Since they cannot, they do as their master has directed, not because they endorse the master's ends without reservation, but rather because half-hearted obedience gets them something else that they want: security, approval, status, or something else. But in other cases, the slave might respond to the master's dictates wholeheartedly. They do as they are directed because they consent to the ends their master has determined, endorsing their merit and choosing means that accord with their master's will. They might even obey out of devotion to the master who commands them. What then? When they respond willingly, wholeheartedly, and with devotion to the one whose practical dictates they obey, what exactly makes them slaves? What distinguishes their agency and obedience from the one who falls under the gentle rule of another and who responds at liberty? Put in the terms that return us to the scene of origin, what distinguishes the dominion that Thomas and the early Reformed locate in the state of innocence from the domination that they exclude from that state? In what follows, I develop a reply that appeals to the account of self-legislation that Thomas offers in the opening question of his so-called treatise on law from the Prima Secunda. There, in question 90, article 3, reply to objection 1, he insists that each rational person who falls under the jurisdiction of another is, quote, a law to himself, sibi est lex, insofar as he shares the direction that he receives from the one who rules him. I defend the following claims. First, that Thomas refers to this self-legislating subject in order to distinguish the one who falls under the jurisdiction of another as a free person from the one who is enslaved by a master. And second, that the distinction between slave and free can be brought into focus by attending to Thomas's four-part definition of law. Why? Because while both the free person and the slave act in accord with the dictates of another, only the former is self-legislating, the latter is not. Attention to Thomas's definition of law can help us account for the difference, and here the key aspects of Thomas's definition turn out to be authority and promulgation. These two criteria, regarded together, can help us distinguish the self-legislating agency of a free person ruled by another from the agency of a slave subject to a master. Along the way, I identify the commitments that we must undertake in order to endorse the conception of self-legislation that Thomas uses to distinguish dominion from domination. Those commitments, I will argue, are embedded in his account of law, even though Thomas himself does not make them explicit. In doing this work for him, in bringing what is implicit to the surface, I attribute to Thomas commitments that he does not explicitly undertake, but perhaps should have. I clarify the conception of self-legislation he is implicitly committed to, given what he says about law, and given what we must say if we are to endorse his conception. My efforts then proceed in Thomas's spirit, but not exactly in his terms. Forgive me, dear Dominicans, I'm making use of Thomas. It's what Protestants do. Finally, insofar as Calvin and the Reformed theologians of the 16th and 17th centuries share roughly Thomas's account of righteous rule in the state of innocence, I suggest that they would have benefited from endorsing something like the conception of self-legislation that I attribute to Thomas. Whether they do so implicitly or not, I'm not yet prepared to say. So, part one, right reason and the common good. The case for thinking that Thomas speaks of self-legislation in order to mark the distinction between slave and free, and that freedom from a slave master's dominating will is the kind of liberty at issue, begins with the political context of his remark. In his treatise on law, Thomas is, among other things, concerned with distinguishing the violent rule of a tyrant from the just rule of a legitimate sovereign. Like any ruler, a tyrant governs those subject to him by directing them to their ends. And yet, unlike the laws of a just sovereign, a tyrant's practical dictates do not accord with a due rule or norm, one that can be used to generate reasons that might assess his conduct and dictates. In the absence of that rule and those reasons, those directives will arrive as expressions of the tyrant's capricious will and power, nothing more. By virtue of that power, his dictates might have governing force. They might determine the ends and actions of those he rules, but, says Thomas, they would arrive more as iniquity than as law. Thomas notes two sources of this iniquity. It comes first, he says, from the mere fact that the tyrant's rule is arbitrary. Here the idea is not simply that in the absence of good reasons that might justify his dictates, the tyrant will quite often secure obedience by resorting to violence. It's also that there's something grievous in itself about being subject to the arbitrary rule of another, about being at the mercy of their will and power and living under the persistent threat of their unaccountable violence. That violence might come or it might not, but the threat of it remains, and this vulnerability is its own injustice. But there's more. A dictate that departs from reason's rule and so arrives as arbitrary constraint is violent itself, says Thomas, violent quite apart from the threat of its coerced enforcement. Why? Because it violates our rational capacity and shared authority to evaluate actions and ends. Human persons act for the sake of ends they regard as good in some way, goods that can be offered as reasons for what they do. When a person is directed to an end that, all things considered, they do not regard as good, at least not for them, not in these circumstances, not apart from this threat of violence, then they lack a good and right reason to act as they have been directed. Here I refer to something more than a reason that accounts for the existence and authority of the directive, because the tyrant has so commanded, its intentional content, because he wants this fence built here at this moment with these tools on this day, or its compulsive force, because he exercises coercive power. I refer rather to the independent value that the tyrant's end might have for those who fall under his rule, value that they might recognize and endorse, makes the end rationally choice-worthy for them, quite apart from the tyrant's menacing power. Without that independent evaluation and endorsement, the tyrant's directive violates the person made subject to it, or so Thomas assumes. Thus he writes, a human directive has, quote, the nature of law only insofar as it partakes of right reason. And it is clear that in this respect it is derived from the eternal law. But insofar as it departs from reason, it is called an unjust law and has the nature not of law, but of violence. Second, and related, the iniquity of tyrannical rule comes from the form that a tyrant's dictates are likely to take. Insofar as they are arbitrary, insofar as they fail to accord with a due rule or rational norm, it's likely that they will be ordained to his private good and use, not to the individual benefit of the ruled, not to the common good they share. What this private good might be, what use he might make of those subject to his rule, none can say in advance, thus the capricious character of his mastery. But here the point is that his arbitrary rule will not be ordained to the common good of the ruled, and this is another aspect of its basic injustice. Justice, you'll recall, regards actions that mediate relations between persons and communities. And just actions are performed, at least in part, in order to set right those relations. When, in a given instance, a just action succeeds, when it delivers the good that is due by right, and when that due is recognized and received for what it is, then a relationship has been set right. At the very least, an important step has been taken toward its rectification. And this relationship, now rectified, will be a good shared in common by those who have standing in the relationship. Since just actions necessarily seek precisely this common good, this rectification of our relationships, it follows that the ruling dictates of a tyrant will necessarily generate actions that fall short of the right. Thomas summarizes this account of the distinguishing features of tyrannical rule with two claims. First, he says, a tyrant's practical dictates are not laws, but rather perversions of them. Perversion precisely because they vacate two necessary features that must be embodied in every dictate that counts as a law: conformity to right reason and regard for the common good. The tyrant might have due authority to rule, he might duly promulgate his practical dictates, but insofar as he subjects the ruled to his private caprice, his directives fall short of the ratio of law. And second, he says that the person subject to a tyrant's capricious and self-serving rule is treated like a slave. In his commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, Thomas writes, quote, "The tyrant does not strive for the common good, but for his own. Thus he acts with his subjects like a workman with a tool, a soul with the body, or a master with a slave. For the tyrant uses his subjects as slaves. And even if it turns out that tyranny's servitude in some way benefits the ruled, the tyrant does not will this benefit for them, but only as it is related to his own purposes. He intends their good only as a means to his own. For the subject of a tyrant's rule is a slave," says Thomas, "and a slave is a kind of living tool, and conversely, a tool is a kind of lifeless slave. And of course, one wishes good for a tool, not in itself, but only as it serves one's own good and use." A tyrant's dictates are not laws, and his subjects are his slaves. Taken together, these two claims suggest the following about self-legislation. Since a tyrant does not promulgate laws, strictly speaking, his enslaved subjects do not fall under his legal jurisdiction. Since his subjects are not governed by laws or participate in the laws of another, they cannot be self-legislating when they act in accord with the rule that rules them. Or put conversely, if they in fact give themselves the law that governs them, then by definition, they are not enslaved. This is what distinguishes a self-legislating subject. They fall under the rule of another, and yet they are not enslaved. To see that this is the explanatory problem that the idea of self-legislation addresses, to see that Thomas refers to this idea in order to distinguish the liberty of those subject to the gentle rule of the righteous from the bondage of those subject to slavery servitude, to see this, consider how a slave might act. In his commentary on the manumission scene, in the 15th chapter of the Gospel of John, where Jesus releases his disciples from slavery and calls them friends instead, Thomas imagines two distinct possibilities, the bad slave and the good. Here he's commenting on Augustine's commentary on the Gospel of John. In each instance, whether good or bad, the slave falls under the rule of a master. They are disposed to their ends in accord with their master's rule, and the ends they seek ultimately serve the master's interests, not their own. But there are differences. In the first case, the bad slave consents to act for the sake of the master's ends, not because he endorses their merit or concedes the authority of the master's command, but rather because he fears the master's violence. Without that threat of violence, he would have no reason to find those ends choiceworthy. Nor does he decide when he will seek those ends or by what means, but rather he acts entirely, here I'm quoting, by the will of the master as if by a certain compulsion. Here we hear echoes of Thomas's remark from his commentary on Aristotle's Ethics, where the slave is a living tool compelled to serve the master's interests. In the second case, the good slave acts on command and for the sake of ends determined by his master, and yet, unlike the bad slave, he acts by himself, insofar as he moves himself to the work, presumably because he endorses those ends, judges them choice-worthy, and because he chooses the means that his own deliberations have identified. The reasons why a good slave might find his master's ends choice-worthy will vary. Some will obey because doing so guarantees a favorable status within the household, others because they find the work pleasant. In some instances, a slave might even love the master, says Thomas, whose dictates he obeys not because he fears the master's power and punishment, but rather his offense and disapproval. This is good servitude, says Thomas, because the slave is clearly moved by his own will, inclined by love to accomplish good works. Both the bad slave and the good act voluntarily, willingly, insofar as they consent to the end for which they act. The end is determined for them, but no matter. They give their consent because they regard it as good in the circumstances they find themselves in. Even the bad slave, who consents out of fear, and who, all things considered, regards what he does with repugnance, consents nevertheless, not because he finds the master's end good in itself, but rather because he wishes to avoid the master's violence. Thus, both the good slave and the bad, in a way, move themselves, even as both are moved by another. But if both are slaves, neither are self-legislating. And it's not simply because they're treated as tools of their master's private purposes. It's also because it's difficult to conclude that either of them rules themselves. The bad slave's repugnance makes this obvious. They might consent to do as their master commands, but they're also set against what they do. The subjunctive state of their will, their velleity, what they wish they could, will, and would if only the circumstances were different, bears witness to their bondage, to the fact that they are ruled by another, but in no way self-ruling. But the good slave's failure to rule himself is far less obvious. Insofar as he consents to the master's ends, as he endorses their merit, and insofar as he deliberates over the means and determines his own choices, he would seem to participate in his own rule. But these appearances deceive, or so I want to argue, and attention to two other aspects of Thomas's treatment of law, authority and promulgation, reveal the deception. So part two, authority and promulgation. Consider the following example. A master directs a slave to arrange a banquet, a feast that will bring honor to the household and delight to his friends. He issues this directive as he departs for the day, leaving the details for the slave to work out, which friends to invite, what to serve, how to arrange the table, who sits next to whom, and so on. So authorized, at least implicitly, the slave is now responsible for all this and can be asked to give an account of what he has done, of the preparations he has made. The slave, let's say, endorses this end, assumes this authority and responsibility, and willingly takes up these tasks in accord with this directive. Not because he fears the master's violence, let's say, but rather because, like the master, he wishes to bring honor to the household and pleasure to its guests. He fears failing in these tasks and disappointing his master, nothing more. Let's say further that this is a Christian household, and let's say that the slave follows the master's rule with certain biblical precedents in mind, namely the parable of the great banquet from Luke 14, where the master commands his servant to include the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame, and the eschatological promises of Matthew 25, where the Son of Man comes as the King of glory and proclaims that whoever in this life brings comfort to the destitute, food to the hungry, drink to the thirsty, welcome to the stranger, provides for him as well. Let's say that the slave endeavors to follow his master's rule and obey his master's command with these biblical precedents in mind, and he applies the key terms embedded in that command, banquet, friend, feast, honor, pleasure, in light of these authoritative antecedents. So, he invites the poor and the lame, pilgrims and strangers, migrants and refugees. He places them in seats of honor. He spends lavishly on their food and drink. He tells them that as friends of this household, they are worthy of this honor, that their pleasure will delight his master, who will welcome them when he returns. When he returns, the master is escorted by the slave to the banquet hall. There, the slave asks the master to recognize two things. First, he asks the master to recognize his, that is to say the slave's, his own rightful authority to act in accord with the master's directive. Since the master left the details of the banquet unspecified, left them for the slave to determine, the slave asks the master to recognize his authority to say what that directive actually entails, what actions it requires, excludes, and permits. Put in the philosophical lingo that I'm assuming here, he petitions the master to recognize his authority over the inferential articulation of the master's dictate, over the practical commitments that can and cannot be inferred from the master's rule, commitments that give that rule its material content, its specific shape and range in these circumstances. The same can be said of the key terms implicit in that rule: banquet, friend, honor, and so on. The slave petitions the master to recognize his own authority over the application of these terms on this day in this household for these purposes, where application involves specifying what kind of gathering counts as a banquet, determining who is a friend and who isn't, making judgments about who deserves honor and how it is bestowed, and so on. In short, the slave asks the master to recognize him, the slave, as someone who has authority over and responsibility for the inferential articulation of the master's rule, authority over and responsibility for the material and conceptual content of that practical directive itself, the one that the master gave and made known as he departed for the day. That's the first petition. So, I have authority over specifying what your dictate requires. Here's the second. The slave then asks the master to recognize his obedience, his success in doing as he has been commanded, in acting in accord with his master's rule. He tells the master what he has done. He asks the master to recognize all that he has done as right, as correctly identifying what the master's own practical dictate actually requires, excludes, and permits in these circumstances. Crucially, this involves a petition to recognize as right the slave's application of the key terms, banquet, friend, honor, and so on this day in this household. And this simultaneously includes a petition to recognize the authority of the biblical precedents that the slave assumes as he applied these key terms in this extra-biblical setting. The Bible provides paradigmatic examples of right application, and the slave asks the master to recognize the normative authority these examples have over the key terms of his own dictate. And he petitions the master to recognize his, that is to say the slave's, right use of these precedents, his faithfulness to them as he applied these key terms in order to specify what the master actually dictated, and so act in accord with the master's will. In this, the slave acts as all of us do whenever we follow a rule, obey a command, or apply a concept. Like the slave, we recognize the normative constraints that bind us as we fall under the authority of a rule, a person, or an established tradition of concept application. Like the slave, we claim our rightful authority to follow, obey, and apply in the circumstances we find ourselves in. So too, we acknowledge certain paradigmatic examples of following this rule, obeying this command, or applying these concepts, examples that function as precedents. Like the slave, we regard ourselves as authorized to specify the material content of the rule, command, or concept in these new circumstances and in light of these precedents. And finally, like the slave, we make ourselves responsible to the relevant others as we see the norm concretely requires, excludes, and permits, and then petition them to recognize both our authority over the material content of the rule and the rightness of what we have said and done, our actual following, obeying, and applying. Most of the time, all this is done unreflectively and by default. We don't give the normative constraints that bind us, the rules, commands, and concepts much thought. In most instances, we follow, obey, and apply without explicitly claiming our rightful authority, acknowledging key precedents, or asking the relevant others to recognize what we have said and done as right, as conforming to the normative demands that bind us. Even so, challenges do come. And when they do, we can be expected to respond, to make explicit the authority we have, the precedents we assume, the words we have spoken, the deeds we have done. We can be expected to take responsibility for all this and give an account of our words and deeds. And we will do all this by petitioning the relevant others to recognize our authority over the inferential articulation of the normative demands that bind us and making them acknowledge our conduct as right. Not making, asking them to acknowledge our conduct as right, as in fact conforming to these demands in these circumstances. In short, we will ask them to recognize us as self-ruling even as we are ruled, self-ruling precisely because we are at least partially responsible for the material and conceptual content of the norms that bind us. So, for example, when I direct my teenage son to take out the trash before he leaves for school, I license him to regard himself as authorized to act in accord with my dictate. Insofar as I leave unspecified most of the details, what counts as trash, as taking it out, as putting it where it belongs, and so on, he can also regard himself as authorized to spell out the material content of my rule as he seeks to obey it. When I return that evening, I notice that while the kitchen bin is empty, wastebaskets across the house are full. I ask him to give an account of his actions. He tells me what he has done, and then petitions me to recognize his authority over the doing and the rightness of the deed, of its conformity to my rule. A conflict ensues. Note well, our disagreement does not regard his authority to specify the content of the rule, apply its key terms in this instance, what counts as trash, or petition me to recognize his authority. And of course, I assume and so recognize his authority over precisely these matters. Why? Because he's my son. Because teenagers in this household have this authority by default, and because nothing could justify denying him that recognition. To do so would be a capricious and arbitrary exercise of paternal power. It would cast our relationship into confusion, turning me into a presumptive master, my son into a potential slave. Rather, the conflict regards the rightness of his actions, his specification of my practical dictate, his actions within the household, his conformity to its norms, while perhaps typically regarded as right by the rest of us, can nevertheless be challenged. And these challenges regard his specification of the material and conceptual content of the norm, not his authority to specify it. This is the key point. To see that it is, return now to the master, the slave, and the banquet, and recall that the slave makes two petitions. First, he petitions the master to recognize his authority over the material and conceptual content of the master's practical directive. And second, once he tells the master what he has done, he then asks the master to recognize his conduct as right, as conforming to the master's rule in light of the precedents he assumes and that the master presumably endorses. Here, finally, the incompatibility of self-rule with slavery comes into focus. Why? Because while the master might respond positively to the slave's petitions and so acknowledge the slave's authority over the material specification of his own practical dictate, he might not. Horrified by the ragged band of migrants and refugees now supping at his table, he might refuse the slave precisely this recognition. He might deny what he appeared to assume as he left for the day, namely that the slave had authority to determine and make explicit what his own dictate requires, excludes, and permits. And if he refuses to credit the slave this authority, then it's unlikely that he will accept the slave's claim to have obeyed his command and acted in accord with his rule. And even if by whim, The master responds positively to the slave's petitions, grants the slave authority over the material and conceptual articulation of his own directive, and thus offers the slave this chance at self-rule. There's no assurance of this. By virtue of the slave's social status, he is never guaranteed this chance. Living as he does at the mercy of his master's will and power, he is forever vulnerable to having his petitions arbitrarily denied. And even if his petitions are recognized and acknowledged by his master, this vulnerability remains, and thus he is never set at liberty, never free from the threat of having his authority over the rule that rules him denied. He is never self-ruling as he is ruled. He is a slave and thus only ever ruled. A tyrant, says Thomas, treats his subjects like slaves. We can now say what this means and what follows from it. And it's not just that he regards his subjects as tools of his private interests, of his capricious disregard for the common good. It's also that he can, if he likes, refuse to recognize their authority over the material and conceptual content of his practical dictates. When they say what they have done and then ask him to recognize his dictates in the content they have made explicit and the actions they have performed, their petitions can be denied. By virtue of their slave-like status, their authority over that content is never assured, and thus they cannot be said to rule themselves, even when the tyrant responds favorably to their petitions. Living at his mercy, ever vulnerable to his whim, their authority is always in doubt, their status as obedient subjects ever uncertain, their presumptive self-rule nothing but a semblance. Taking our lead from Thomas's definition of law, we can now say that by contrast, those who fall into the jurisdiction of a righteous sovereign are not only self-ruling, but self-legislating. And not simply because the rule that governs their actions accord with a rational norm and directs them to a common good, but also, and crucially, because they share authority with the one who rules them for the content of the laws, and because they promulgate that content when they petition for recognition. A petition for recognition is the kind of promulgation that befits the ruled who are also self-legislating. The self-legislating petitioner says, in effect, this is the law. This is the law that binds those of us who fall under its jurisdiction. This is its specific content. This is what it requires and excludes in these particular circumstances. In saying this, they claim an entitlement that comes with their status as citizens under the law. They claim their rightful authority to specify the law's content as they act in accord with the law's demands. And yet, unlike the subject of a tyrant's rule, they do not beg, plead, or flatter in order to secure a capricious favor. Rather, they assume this authority comes with their normative status, and they implicitly seek confirmation of this standing as they ask the sovereign to recognize as right not only their inferential articulation of his law, but also the precedents they have assumed and the actions they have performed. In this way, here I'm quoting Thomas again, in this way, everyone is a law unto themselves, insofar as they make such a petition and implicitly claim such authority as a free subject of the laws. I will conclude. I began by noting that both Thomas and the Reformed theologians of the 16th and 17th centuries do too little to distinguish the dominion that they imagine in the state of innocence from the domination that they exclude from that state. I argued that attention to Thomas's account of law, in particular his claim that those who fall under the jurisdiction of another are also self-legislating, helps bring this distinction into focus. And I spelled out what Thomas's account of self-legislation implicitly commits him to, namely that a person who falls under the jurisdiction of another shares responsibility for the material and conceptual content of the rule that rules them. Suppose we endorse Thomas's account of law and self-legislation. Suppose further we accept the treatment of rule following, authority, and petition that are implicit in that account. Will these commitments by themselves allow us to distinguish dominion from domination, righteous rule from slavery servitude? I don't think so. Rather, I think that we, and here I refer to the inhabitants of the liberal democracies of the modern West, Rather, I think that we assume that those who have a share in the rule that rules them must be able to ask their rulers to give an account of the laws they make and to hold them to account when the laws they have made fall short of the right. We assume, in other words, that without the authority and capacity to hold their rulers to account, and without these practices of accountability made durable in custom, law, and habit, even self-legislating subjects will be vulnerable to the arbitrary power of those who rule them. They will still be potentially dominated. Do Thomas and the early Reformed share our assumption about accountability of rulers to the ruled? I don't know, but I doubt it. Rather, I suspect that by their lights, rulers are accountable not to those subject to them, but to God, whose delegated authority legitimates their rule. Those of us, and here I'm speaking for myself, those of us who want it both ways, with rulers accountable to God and the eternal law, but also to those whom they rule, we will need, I suspect, a different collection of theological tools, one that includes not simply law and self-legislation, but covenant and friendship. These are topics for another day. Thank you.
Okay, so excuse me if there's a little bit of a long prologue. I just want to see if I got some of this right. Seeing that what's all this stuff about slavery? Because that like kind of key theme, but I think now I understand or I want to see. So it looks like here's two extremes you want to avoid. Extreme A is Aristotle, that there are people who are actually slaves. It turns out on this account, actually we are supposed to participate in the law for being self-legislating. But we're relative to the natural law and the eternal law of God, and we live in community as self-legislators through communion in subjugation or subjection to a higher, life-giving covenantal law of God. Other extreme Kantian modern self-legislators who are not relative to divine law, who are a law unto themselves without a higher law they participate in. But what I saw you do at the end, which was kind of suggestive and said evocatively, was before the fall, we can somehow live in subjection to God, loving towards subjection, or in communion with God, covenant with God. We use the word covenant friendship, which are great for Catholics as a language of grace. So we live in the grace of covenant and friendship with God. Before the fall, we can live in communion with one another and be self-legislators, subject to one another in freedom and subject to God in freedom. After the fall, whether we think we're the Aristotelian masters and slaves, or we think we're the Kantian self-legislators, we're probably going to end up slaves because we don't know what we're subject to, or the danger. It looks to me like it could veer towards a very sober view of the human being in the state of so-called the natural state without grace, where now we're self-legislating, but we're really subjective whimsically to one another as tyrants or masters to slaves, and all of us have maybe mistaken ideas about nature and law, where we're not really free and not self-legislating under God in the right way. Or am I reading that last part?
So I thought my talk had a lot of moving parts, but your question has a lot of moving parts. There's a number of things about Thomas's account of slavery that I confess to just not understanding. So, he's trying to hold together what he has learned from Aristotle and what he's learned from Augustine. Augustine doesn't think they're natural slaves. He thinks slavery is penal for sin. And Thomas affirms that. He also affirms what Aristotle says. And he wants both things. And he never really puzzles about the compatibility between these two claims, as far as I can tell. So I can speculate, but I'm not going to. So that's the first point in response to your question. Second, you can see what I'm trying to do. I want to lift up a kind of self-legislation that is not Kantian, right? I reject the Kantian notion of self-legislation. I can make no sense of it. But here we see Thomas using the language. It's a toss-off remark. I found very little commentary on it, and I'm just trying to make sense of it. What does it mean to be self-legislating? And the remark appears in the opening question of the Treatise on Law, where he's specifying the four-part aspect of what a law is. So you're not going to fall under legal jurisdiction, strictly speaking, unless the lawgiver is authorized to give a law. If the law is not directed to the common good, if the law is not properly promulgated, and what's the fourth? In accord with right reason. So, I mean, what I'm doing by spelling out this account of self-legislation is saying, well, okay, if you're self-legislating, then you have to tick those four boxes. You, the person who falls under the jurisdiction of another, if you're sharing in the rule that rules them, and if you're sharing in the legislation that you fall under, then, right, your obedience to that law must be, your self-legislating obedience to that law must be ordered to the common good, must be rational in some way, it must be promulgated in some way, and you must have authority to do it. So I'm just trying to sort this out. This is what the whole talk is about. So, yes, in the state of innocence, if there was political rule, Thomas says there was, that makes perfect sense to me. And if there were some who were subject to the rule of others, then they were self-legislating. Okay, well, what does that mean? What I'm trying to argue is that they share responsibility for the material content of any specific dictate. Because no specific dictate can be so specific that every little detail is worked out. So notice in my two examples, my domestic one and my master-slave one, a dictate is given, and yet the details are left somewhat indeterminate. And thus there's then an implicit authorization. The person who makes the dictate authorizes the one who is supposed to obey to specify its details. Okay? They're filling out the material content of the dictate and thus saying what it actually requires in a specific circumstance. And then they petition for recognition. And it's a two-part petition. Recognize my authority to spell out its details, and recognize as right what I have said and done. So, after the fall, the key question then, I take it what you're asking is going to be authority. So in other words, are there authoritative lawgivers? And are we, broken and fallen as we are, fit to recognize who's authoritative and who isn't? If you satisfy all those conditions, I think I've specified what's involved in obeying the command of another, a legal command of another. That's all I'm doing. In many respects, it's a very formal argument.
Thank you, Professor Berlin. Really enjoyed that. So your point of departure here is this account of distinction between dominion and domination is the doctrine of original righteousness and the story of the fall. But I wonder to what extent your account requires a theological backstory with theological motivation. In other words, could you cut your story away from a mythic account of original righteousness or treat it as some kind of just so story that doesn't presume some kind of stage of original righteousness and still get the same result? And is that a virtue? In other words, could you write philosophically independent of this theological noise?
So is there a distinction between dominion and domination apart from any theological account of original righteousness, a doctrine of creation?
Original righteousness, drop the backstory, and you still have your account. Is that good or bad?
You can still have that account, yes. In some respects, in this talk, all I'm doing is interpreting Thomas in question 96, article 4 of the Prima Pars. He says, look, there would be rule. I think the backstory has to be, again, a kind of conceptual one. Can we have political rule without violence? Right. This used to be a debate between Thomists and Augustinians, I think. I think the Augustinians have to concede. And in fact, I think Augustine concedes. I think Augustine's position is much closer to Thomas's, that in fact, there's no necessary violence or coercion built into the idea of law. And if that's so, then we can imagine rule in the state of innocence. I think, yeah. I need to think more about your question, Oliver. Do you have a hunch about it?
I think you could draw the backstory and still.
No, I mean, I absolutely think that, but then I'm thinking like, well, then why does that matter? What's at stake theologically?
Well, you might think it matters if you want to run it as a sort of political moral independent of the particular theological ground.
Yeah.
A particular kind of liberal who thinks that's the point.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is actually a place of possible conversation and agreement between Thomists, say, with deep theological commitments, and Augustinians, I think, with similar sorts of commitments, and certain sort of strands of secular political theory, particularly the Republican strands, right? So you say you've been reading Hobbes. Well, all the Republican political theorists go back to Hobbes or back to Machiavelli, and this is actually a very interesting conversation to have. Yep. So we Christians who work in political theology tend to think we're divided against that crowd. Maybe not.
Okay, so we have time for one last question.
I'd like to ask for two petitions. I can see why a negative or the possibility, the ever-present possibility of a negative answer to the first petition is arbitrary and doesn't make perfect sense. And I'd like to ask if, this is partly like your example of banquet, it doesn't matter that it's a slave that's organized a banquet, rather than saying son. But so, on the second petition to recognize the rightness, is the slave in a different position from the free person on that petition? And are there, if there's a disagreement between the subordinate and the superior on the rightness of the action, is there anything as it were within the theory on the question of the free versus the slave, about how one resolves that disagreement? So my first question is, if we have first petition, that's fine. Second petition is to recognize the rightness of the act. Is the slave just in principle in a different position with regard to the master on that position than, say, your son is with regard to you? And does that different position, if there is one, have anything to do with how one has it out over a disagreement on whether things are done?
Yeah, I'm not certain how to answer this question. I mean, so I put a lot of emphasis on the first petition to distinguish slave and free, right? So the key is whether the person subject to the rule of another has recognizable authority to specify the content of the dictate. I take it that what distinguishes slavery is that question is always uncertain. Whereas the contrast with my domestic scene with my son is my son can basically assume it. It's a default. So let's go back to the scene you imagine. So let's say the master recognizes the slave's authority over the material content of his own dictate, and then says, okay, look what I've done. Isn't this right? I think once you get to that point, it's simply a matter of the facts on the ground. Right, and I'm sorry, the assessment of the precedents that determine what rule following in that instance actually involves. And again, that's a dispute between persons. But once the first petition is acknowledged, you're an authority on this. I'm an authority on this too. Now let's dispute about the rightness of the action. They seem to be somewhat on equal footing. Until they're not. I mean, if it's a slave, the master can always arbitrarily say, sorry, you're wrong, doesn't matter. Whereas if I did that to my son, he would, as I say, he would think that our relationship had fallen into confusion and he wouldn't really know who I was anymore or who he was. Whereas I take it the roles are determinate, let's say, in the master-slave relationship. I don't know if that helps. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our speaker.